Game designer Thomas Grove here, and I have created a simple game in Unity and then recreated it in Godot in order to test the kind of performance and usability differences of these two engines. And I'm going to share some of the results of those tests today. I've been working on a horror art game with my son for a short while now, and I'm not going to talk much about the game today, just how it was working in both engines. I'm going to give some stat differences between the two engines and a little bit of opinions about using both of the engines. So first of all, let me talk about the state of the game when I decided to start porting it to Godot. I had a completely finished character controller that handles all of the edge cases I think this game would have, a camera transition system and a scene transition system, and a custom dither shader. So once I had finished doing that in Unity, I decided maybe I should try creating this in Godot also, because it's kind of a manageable level of stuff. For a long time, I've really wanted to see a side-by-side apples-to-apples comparison between the two engines, not like the same game made by different developers or whatever. So I just thought this was my chance to finally do that and really decide whether I want to move forward with Godot or keep using Unity. The first thing that you might come across when using either of these engines is you have to install it. And do you even have enough space on your hard drive? For Unity, you need both Unity Hub, which lets you manage the different versions of Unity, plus the Unity editor itself. And when you add those together, you're looking at like 21 gigs of hard drive space just to install Unity. And Godot is 164 megs, so that's 129 times difference in size. So that could be a deciding factor for you right there. If you don't have a lot of free hard drive space on your computer, you might have to choose a smaller engine than Unity. From just the desktop, clicking on the editor and getting the project to load, how long does it take? Well, as you can see in this example here, which I'm playing back at a 4 times speed, I'm playing the Godot game before the Unity Hub has even finished loading, let alone the Unity editor itself, let alone my project within the Unity editor. So in total there we had 13 and a half seconds to load Godot from nothing to in my project, and a minute 20 to do the same in Unity, which is a 5.4 times difference in duration. Here's some side-by-side gameplay of the two games. They're both playing at the same time on the computer with one controller controlling both of them. Now, there's a little problem in that somehow like the tuning of my walk speed seems to be a little bit different in both. So I'm kind of exiting one room before I get to the same exit in the Godot version. So we'll have some points where I end up just walking into a corner so I can try to realign the characters. But you can see I wasn't able to get like a one-to-one visual match with them. I started with the Unity version, and I'm not trying extra hard to do the art in this version because my son's making the final real art for the game. But just like some basic lighting and basic textures in one of the rooms just to see really how the dither filter looks in some different scenarios. And well, anyways, I think they both look fine. And actually, I'm kind of more partial to the way the Godot one looks. I spent a little bit more time working out ways how to have the corners of the building kind of fade to black. I actually did that in both of them, but I applied it more liberally in the Godot version. I think they both look fine, and with enough time in either one, you could push them into your final art direction that you were going to go for. Let's see, just a few things about this. I do have a follow cam in both. In the Unity version, I relied on Cinema Machine. However, in the Godot version, I rolled my own solution for that, which I was a little hesitant to do, but in the end, I prefer it over the Unity one. I've got all the dials that I need, and it's a little bit more of a simple setup. This might be the best chance to kind of talk about some of the differences between working in the two engines. So more of the qualitative things. I think I spent about the same amount of time working on both versions. Now, you would think potentially the Godot one could go faster because I've already done it once, so it's not that hard to do it a second time. And that's true, but I had a lot less motivation to redo something I've already done. One benefit, though, one positive, is that I do think in many cases I landed on a slightly better architecture for doing things, just because I started with the foreknowledge of where I needed to end up. There's some things that in Unity that it just does wonderfully and easily, that in Godot is a lot more hitting your head against the wall. So some things in Godot you just have to do a very specific way. And if you know that way, it's fine, it's easy. But I'm so familiar with Unity and very new to Godot. So to kind of learn some of its nuances and intricacies was sometimes frustrating. I can give maybe two examples. One would be rigged characters. So in Unity animation system, you can put in a character that's in a T pose, in an A pose. Either one's fine, and it's just going to kind of play the animation on your character. You could have root motion or not root motion, and either's fine also. Godot's not as flexible in that way. They really want you to have a T pose, not an A pose, and my character was in an A pose. And then if you are not going to be using root motion, they really want you to not have root motion on the character. Now, there's ways around it, of course. If you're using Mixamo, for instance, you could download a version of the animation without root motion. You could remove the root motion in Blender, or someone has even written a plugin for Godot that will rewrite the file without a root motion. Like in Unity, you'd kind of just use the FBX files as the animation files, and it's kind of easy. You just throw them in there and it works. Godot has several steps you have to go through to identify the animations, kind of save them as a resource, and then map them into this other animation book or something like that. That part's like a little bit of a hassle. Unity's URP, I think, is a little bit more mature than Godot's pipeline at this point, especially when it comes to, I had some very specific requirements. Like I had this dither effect I wanted to do, but it was being applied before transparency, and I wanted it to be applied after transparency. And so I had to kind of make my own HLSL, compositor type shader, which was a little bit harder for me. And finally, it was able to do everything I needed it to, but I think I'm losing a little bit of performance there, which we'll see later. And then lastly, I don't know if I can show two examples here in the actual editor. Let me just open it up quickly. If you're not familiar with the editor, there's a lot of times where some things will be kind of hidden. For instance, there's a lot of times you'll see something like this, and you might read a tutorial that says, oh, just change such and such property on this material, for instance. And you're like, oh, I don't see it. Well, you have to click on it, and then it expands it. So that's a little gotcha that you might not know. You'll oftentimes have to make something unique so that you can even edit it at all, or certainly so that it's only editing it on that instance and not everywhere. Another thing to keep in mind. One of the things that was really driving me crazy with the Unity version was every time I changed a shader, anytime I changed my character controller script, was like my biggest script in the game right now, it would take a noticeable amount of time for the script to compile. One of the things that made me fall in love with Unity many, many years ago was how instant it was and how I didn't have to wait for things to compile. Well, things have changed over the years, and now when you want to compile a script in Unity, it takes a non-trivial amount of time. So here's both projects compiling the player controller script. It took the Godot version half a second. Took Unity 15 and a half seconds to compile basically the same script, which is a 31 times difference. Unity, I think, does by default like a pretty good job when it's exporting a project of only including the assets and optimized assets that are being used in the scenes that you're using in your project. Godot can do that too, but it's not on by default. So when I first exported this project, I got a pretty big file size, much bigger than I was expecting, because I thought it was going to include the assets just like Unity did, and it included all the assets I had in my project. So I reorganized a little bit, and I made like just a source assets folder, and then in the export, I ended up just making this little exclusion so it won't include that. There's another way to do that also, which is this one. You could actually change it to, for instance, selected scenes and dependencies, or selected resources and dependencies, or all resources except for. So if I did that and then I excluded my asset source folder, that would be kind of the same thing as this text I had down there. But anyways, once you do that, when you're not including all of your source files, you have a much smaller project. So something that kind of Unity just does by default, and Godot can do it too, but you have to set it up yourself kind of manually. And I think that's it. That's like the only bad things about working in Godot that I can think of. Not being able to put multiple script components on one game object took a little bit of getting used to, but I'm fine with it. Having just extra nodes for each time you want to have a different script on an object is fine. Once you have your project done, you want to build it. As I was just showing, how long is that going to take to build your project for PC, for example? Well, the first time I built in both, it took 15 minutes in Unity. In Godot takes 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, which is a 341 times difference. But I ended up exporting Unity again later, and the result was a lot faster the second time I exported to PC. The second time through, it only took me 52 or almost 53 seconds to do it. So it's still a 20 times difference, but not as bad as the first time. I was a little reluctant to export again, but I wanted to get like a fair side-by-side comparison in terms of the performance. In the Godot version, I had optimized the character's material to only use one material for the whole character, and the Unity wasn't optimized. So the Unity, like the shirt was one material, the shoes are one material, the skin was one material. So I exported a version where I've collapsed that down to just one material, just the skin, just so I could get like a fair apples to apples comparison on the performance. Now I'm going to click on both of the builds and see how long it takes for the games to load. You can see the Godot game finishes loading in 2 seconds and 9 frames. And the Unity game takes about 10.5 seconds. That's about a 5 times difference in game launch time. And then lastly, I think we just have a performance comparison here. When I first wanted to compare the frame rate of the two games, I got a pretty shocking result. It looked like my Godot was giving me, in editor, 950 frames, whereas Unity was giving me somewhere between 200 and 300 frames. It turned out Godot actually has 2 profilers. One shows you just like the logic and the physics, and the other one shows you the rendering, and I wasn't looking at that one. So now the game is intended to be played at 60 frames per second, but I turned off VSync to see what my performance was going to be, to see how much headroom I have, and just to know the engine's performances. And here's pretty shocking. Godot's performance in editor and in the final build is pretty much the same. But Unity has a pretty big overhead in editor. The final export was shockingly fast. 650 to even sometimes 730 frames in this bare bones room I have here. One thing that's pretty interesting is the difference in how the resources are. The GPU on the Godot version is GPU bound, I guess is the word you'd use. The only thing limiting my frame rate on the Godot version is like how much it's using the GPU. But the Godot version's hardly using any CPU there. Look at this, I'm 95% GPU and 8% CPU. Versus Unity, 76% GPU, 29% CPU. Now, I made another build of the Godot version where I changed my global illumination from the voxel GI to the lightmap GI. And so I did that and also adjusted my resolution a little bit, and I got frame rates up to 630 on the Godot version as well. I decided to restart the computer and try both tests once again, but without Godot running in the background, Unity running in the background, DaVinci Resolve running in the background, and OBS running in the background. And we're breaking 1,050 frames per second on the Godot version and 850 frames per second on the Unity version. So the result's a bit inconclusive. In short, I'm probably going to continue using Godot for this project. Just because everything in it feels a little bit more custom to me. You know, the business practices of the few years ago. I can say this. if we look at all this data, like Godot beat Unity on every metric except for the final output FPS. And they were pretty close. And both of them are far beyond my headroom of 60 frames per second. I'm up to like 600. So I've got 10x extra frame rate to play around with. So I'm not too worried about the performance on that. So I hope this was interesting. Both engines very capable. I was able to make what I wanted to make in both of them. More about the actual game in a future video. I'll talk about the character controller and some of that stuff in more detail later. Thanks for listening and have a great day. Use whatever engine you want, but if you were on the fence about using Godot, you're like, oh, I'm not sure if it's capable. It is capable, and there's so many benefits, especially if you're running on a computer with not a lot of hard drive space. So hope that's helpful. Thank you, and goodbye.